Good evening, everyone. I'm Annika Allen, and I'm a diversity inclusion professional by day in financial services. And outside of that, I also run an award ceremony called the Black Magic Awards, where I celebrate the trailblazers and the change makers in the Black British community. So I'm excited to be here today and to hear these fantastic postgraduate researchers research on implicit bias, two whom are in the room with me, and one who's joining us virtually on Teams. So we're talking about the topic of implicit bias. Some people say unconscious bias, so you can say either. Both basically mean the same thing. And this topic has, it's gained significant traction over the past few years. A lot of work has been done to address the challenge of implicit bias in the commercial sector, and the rationale for this is often connected to greater diversity, which is then linked to the healthy business performance. However, there are sectors where implicit bias could have negative implications, and research is one of them, which is why we're here today. So research underpins key messages to the general public, which helps us to make decisions about our health, finances, and even our consumption of the arts. So getting right goes beyond a healthy bottom line. The purpose of this round table, or square table, or rectangle actually, is to highlight the existence and ramifications of implicit bias within research. And by the end of the discussion, we hope to have also highlighted some ways in which we can begin to check for and mitigate these biases. This evening, we'll be speaking with the postgraduate researchers in different fields of research about their experiences and insights regarding bias as it pertains to their work. These researchers are joined by panelists with experience in that field who will reflect on those insights shared and contribute to the discussion. Our postgraduate researchers for this evening are John Tetka. Say hi, so they know who you are, John. Julian Alexander and Shaherah Jordan. Hi. And they are joined by Cedric Lombion. Have I said that right, Cedric? Beatrice, Newman, and Mostert. Have I said that right?
100%.
So we're going to get started. And this evening's event with Shaherah Jordan is going to start with you first. Your research explores electric vehicle adoption in London from a cultural perspective.
But my work was on electric vehicle adoption in London, but from a cultural perspective. And I think the reason I'm here today is because bias actually drove my research unconsciously and unconsciously. And what I mean by that is that when I was beginning to explore a lot of the papers from my literature review on electric vehicles generally, I wasn't aware that I was aware of it, but I became aware of a real gap in the data concerning or relating to ethnicity specifically. There was only one paper that I reviewed, that I read, that captured the ethnicity data of the respondents. And this was on the papers regarding the barriers and motivators to electric vehicle adoption. And I say I only noticed it because it was my own, I guess, bias that kind of led me to almost look for this, much in the way that a lot of us possibly, when we go to events where we know that we're going to be one of the few people in the room, be it female, be it Black, whatever, you kind of sometimes, you might be guilty of looking for someone in the room who looks like you. And I found myself doing that with my papers. I was looking, going, okay, well, what does this mean for people of color? So that was kind of an accidental way that I stumbled upon it. And the second thing that kind of drove me to look into it further was when I was at an electric vehicle conference. And it was quite embarrassing how I discovered that this was here, but I'm going to share this anyway. One delegate that I've spoken to told me that he was so excited that he just put down his $5,000 for his brand new I-Pace, and he couldn't wait to get it in 6 months' time. And I thought that was the most preposterous thing I've ever heard of, that I'm going to put that much money on a car and not get to drive it for months. So when I met the Jaguar, kind of delegates, and I was speaking to them, I, with my then ignorance, thought I was being cute in conversation, said, I can't believe that battery supply is so intense that you pay your deposit now and not get your vehicle for months. And this woman just kind of looked at me and was like, that's standard with all new vehicles. And it was like, in that moment, I realized that not only my bias was showing, but my socioeconomic status was showing, that I had never purchased a car in such a way that I wasn't even aware that there was a whole world of car buying that involved paying that much money and not driving it for months. It still blows my mind, to be honest. But then in that moment, I realized, hang on a second, I've been approaching my research from a perspective of bias. I've come into this expecting that people buy their cars outright, because my own bias, or that voice that, you know, in my case, it's my father's voice that was telling me that, you know, cars are a liability, you should never pay on them. That voice had become the voice. It had become my bias. And I had entered my own research with that bias, and I met it head on in a space that I didn't think I could. But what that led me to understand when I took that thinking into my work was that, hey, there are a lot of other researchers that have led in this space that also walked into this research with their own bias. And the proof of that for me was when I was working on, you know, there are 3 key barriers to adoption that are widely accepted in this space. And they are range anxiety, charging time, and price. So within the price barrier, as I was kind of digging and digging and digging, I was seeing that a lot of the, I guess then academics were saying that electric vehicles are more economical to run than internal combustible engine vehicles, or ICE vehicles as I call them. It didn't sit right with me. And so I kept using my bias to start to look into it. What do you mean EVs are cheaper to run? And what I came to understand that when I pulled down the formula that kind of broke down all of the variables of car ownership, from the tax to the interest to the sticker price for the car, call it sticker price, you know, the price for the car, and the fuel or gas or what have you, that these models were saying that when you put these 2 things side by side, the numbers run better for EVs than they run for ICE vehicles. But when I, as a researcher, began to pick apart that formula, that variable of price was actually a monthly payment. And that in and of itself for me flawed not just the research, but that insight that was being pumped in a kind of headline space of EVs are cheaper to run than ICE vehicles. Based on that formula, the headline should have been EVs are cheaper to run than ICE vehicles for some people. Because the one thing I did prove through my own research is that I wasn't the only one that bought my vehicles outright. You know, most of my sample preferred to buy their vehicle outright in London. And so it just led me to understand that if I hadn't brought my bias, my own bias to the table, I wouldn't have understood that there was a bias to even counter. And it led me to really, I think the big thing for me was that it's important that academia is diverse, so that we can, when we start to bring all of these different notions and ideas and unconscious biases to the table, we get a bit of a wake-up call. We realize, ooh, hold on a second, the world that I live in is not the world. There are other spaces and segments that I need to consider before I make catch-all statements. Or when I'm doing my research, I need to make sure that it's couched in a really responsible way that says, in London, or for a certain segment, or at a certain time of the year, but not just blanket phrases that actually don't apply to the entire population. And so that was my kind of introduction to the impact, because then in a sense, these headlines are gaslighting people, because you've now got people hearing, well, they're cheaper to run, but they're thinking they're not, but the headlines say they are, and the researchers said they are, so that means that you're wrong. And that's something we've got to really guard against, is making sure that as researchers, when we're sharing our insights, that 1, we've checked our bias, and 2, we've made sure that we're presenting it with all of the caveats that are needed for responsible dissemination of information. So that's my summary on bias in my work. Andre, what are your thoughts on this is the first time you've heard about my work. So what are your thoughts on what I've just shared?
Well, I mean, you've taken me down about 15 different avenues all at once. I think I'll start with one of my own biases that I've brought to this discussion, and then we go from there. All right. In that, one thing I've always found, I mean, as researchers, we build from hypotheses and we often move forward. And something that I haven't seen in a lot of the discourse is the fact that most research builds within an ecosystem of confirmation bias. So we confirm our own bias because we wanted to actually support the hypotheses that we bring to the table. Now, obviously, something like electric vehicles being quite a new area. I mean, I must say, when I think about car buying, I never once gave ethnicity a moment's thought. in terms of, how people buy cars. I mean, I buy a car. Yes, I don't pay cash because I don't have the cash to pay cash. So if I look at your own experience, I mean, your example about how we move into a room and look for a space which confirms the bias we bring into the room is a fascinating topic, and probably way beyond a round table of this nature. But I think it's very difficult, and to speak more broadly, I think it's very difficult for us to overcome, whether we call it unconscious bias or conscious bias. I mean, we are fundamentally biased animals. We have to be. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about teaching entrepreneurship. I mean, entrepreneurship is fundamentally built on bias, because I have to discriminate against who my customer is going to be. Now, I may be selling a product for men's beards. I cannot make it unisex, for example. So, it's just the fact that I'm targeting men who wear beards because that's the product that I'm trying to sell. Now, I think we are moving into a very interesting, wider context. I mean, how do we avoid bias in our research? And without the existence of an objective truth, we cannot avoid bias. Some sort of bias is always going to feed into what we do. How we manage that bias, I think, is the challenge. And I mean, the quicker we can become aware of the bias that we bring to the process, the easier it is for us to say, well, how do we overcome? And I mean, the ideal researcher is one who has no vested interest in the outcome. Now, you cannot actually be an effective researcher if you have no vested interest in the outcome. Otherwise, your motivation dies. If I have no vested interest in the outcome and I'm trying to be completely objective, I'm almost straitjacketing myself, because I'm saying, well, I want to sort of look from the outside, and that's very difficult. So that's my immediate knee-jerk response. I'll probably think through it a bit further later, and I'll change everything I said and want to take it all back.
Next, we're going to hear from John Tetka on his work on socio-political crises. And John is joined by Cedric Lombion from the School of Data. So, John?
I'm John Tetka. I'm based in Berlin, so that's why I'm online. I would have been happy to also sit in with you. But yeah, I'm online with Cedric Lombion, who works he works before for School of Data, but now it works for the Open Knowledge Foundation. Maybe you want to introduce yourself before I continue, Cedric?
Yes. So hi everyone, Cedric Lombion. I am the Data Innovation Lead at the Open Knowledge Foundation. I come from a social science background, and my work consists mostly in coordinating programs or sort of learning, training programs for a variety of people around the world, journalists, civic organizations, government officials, and the focus of our trainings are around data, all kind of data. So I am not the expert in all kind of data, but rather we work with people who both have the contextual knowledge and expertise because they come from those regions where we run the trainings, and the specific technical data expertise. And I work with all those brilliant people in supporting others in making use and making sense of data as part of their work.
Thank you, Cedric. So I do research at the University of London in data science, trying to develop, working to develop a country risk assessment model that is human life centric. So the idea in my research is to put the human life in the center of all interests, social, political, and economic interest. So to not get any lost because to pay the price of the development. So that's quite challenging. And in developing this assessment model, I want to use large data sets available from international organization that inform about countries, social, political, and economic aspects, and then applying to these data sets, deep learning and various machine learning algorithms to be able to assess what type of indicators might help to bring development without necessarily getting massive people killed on the way. So, but doing this research, I found some very unexpected and interesting bias that I will also happy to share with you today. But before doing that, maybe one question for you, Cedric, will be to know what is the usual type of bias you are facing when you are doing your work.
Sure. So I work, as I mentioned, with a variety of audiences, but I guess we have one common problem, which is missing or incomplete data. So if you say work with a city that collects information about how many cars or how many bicycles cross the street, depending on how the sensor is designed, it may be on the road, right? So a car rolls over the sensor and then it's counted as one car. But the sensor breaks sometimes, and you don't know when it breaks. And so when you yourself request that data and see those like numbers, you don't necessarily know when the sensor was like offline for 2 hours or there was a problem in communicating the data, etc. So a very common issue is like this sort of problems in the sort of methodology of making that data real, and that's why it's very important to understand how is that data put together, what is the process. So that is a big issue, and I guess a very other common issue is a sort of bias in terms of the population that is the sort of sample bias, the population that is targeted. So it may be when civic organizations will work with like populations, local populations, and they will do social surveys to argue their points. But the problem is, even if they will intentioned, the problem is they will simply survey the people they have easily access to rather than survey the whole population or a representative sample. They're not researchers, but they do use data, and so we have to bring them a bit closer to proper research methods. And another more wide scale issue around the same issue is around geographical data and maps in general. There's been a very long history of studying bias in maps and very long history of activism around this. And of course, we have less geographical data around rural areas compared to urban areas. And that has implications when we use geographical data to plan disaster preparedness policies or a lot of things like that, or that affects a lot, for example, indigenous community around the world whose places of living are often very poorly mapped or mapped with framing that does not match how they occupy the land.
Thank you. Allow me now to present the bias that I found in my research. Like I said, I had to compile countries' data from all over from global, and I wanted to use 10 years information to train my models. And before starting any analysis, I had to clean up the data set, of course, to remove empty fields or missing indicators. And I had to remove all the countries you see on this slide. And I was surprised because actually on this slide you can see 27 countries, and all these 27 countries have more than 50% of the data missing in 10 years, which is quite a lot. So definitely for a comparative analysis, I had to exclude them all. But of course, in my research, like we all do, okay, I use the remaining countries to do the research, train my models, and do all the complete my investigation. But I came back, and actually is in the previous conference that this point of this the point of this information missing have been highlighted, and that's why I'll also join this group to present this. I started to investigate what are the correlations between all these countries. What do they have in common? Why do we have this amount of countries with more than 50% of the data missing? And this is what I found as similarities between all these countries. So first, a large majority of the countries, I would say 24 countries, are higher and upper level income countries with a very tiny population of less than 300,000 inhabitants, and yeah, like I said previously, more than 50% of the data completely missing. But this is the minimum, because we even had countries with more than 90% of the data missing, so almost nothing in 10 years. And the second group of countries that I found was country under tension, and this concerned three countries: Somalia, the North Somalia, and South Korea. So, and these are low-income countries with a significant, quite important population, more than 10 millions. But yeah, of course, as you could imagine, facing a particular situation, war in Somalia, or under political economic threats in Korea. So this is only what I found as similarities between these countries, but still it doesn't tell me why we don't have this data missing. Why do we, and especially talking about, I mean, for the country attention, we can understand maybe there's no one to collect the data because of the context or the situation, ongoing situation. But about Iceland and microstate, how could we explain that in some countries we don't have the data? I mean, we can maybe suppose that in some countries like the first one, Saint Martin, which is an island, the Caribbean, which is still under the French Republic, we don't have data, maybe because the data are counted into the French state. But this might be the case, and I don't want to bring up here all the colonization things that I found that shocked me a little bit. I couldn't believe that we still have right now so many countries under the British or French or Danish authority or US authority. These are quite significant number of countries, but still, what could justify that for rich countries we don't have any information, and for a tiny population? I mean, you can collect this data in probably in a week or month for all type of data you want from this country, but we don't have that. What could explain or justify that? So this is a question to you, Cedric, and maybe a question also to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. So Cedric, so to answer that question, what are your thoughts?
What are your thoughts? Yeah.
The data collection at the country level is we have to understand that it's a collective effort that comes from not necessarily a central government, but a lot of different agencies which may or may not have the actual capacity to properly collect that data. It is related to political efforts to professionalize the action of the state. It is also related to corruption efforts. It is partly encouraged or sometimes almost coerced by the World Bank or international institutions in exchange for funding. For example, if you want to get that 100 million to build roads, then you need to properly set up a data collection process. But it's sort of a very it's a multi sort of factor model that ends up with that country having that data about human development, or that data about road quality, or that data about health infrastructure actually available. And so this is, and not even talking about, when a state is, a head of state is being deposed, where there's a coup, and then people burn the archives, and from there you lose competencies, you lose archives, etc. So that's also to consider. There's no single answer from for all the countries that John listed, but this is often what we face when we work with governments, is that there are sometimes even personal issues that explain why it's difficult to access a specific data set. And very commonly, we find that simply the data set exists but is not digitized, for example. And lastly, what's interesting as well to find is that as I work with countries and people around the world, I live in France. I'm French, and I often find that I will work in Indonesia, for example, and work on data around public contracting, public procurement, and go back to France and say, well, actually, we're not as advanced as Indonesia, and so there are many factors explaining that, but that's also the reality of the sort of government data.
Hi, I'm Esther. Speaking about statistics, I had a colleague who tried to work with the indigenous Ainu population in Japan, and what they found was that they were very resistant to having statistics created for them because they were deeply distrustful of how they were going to be used. And I'm curious how that factors into your research, Jean, and if perhaps there is an element of actually sometimes they don't want it to be weaponized against them, so they push out. Do you encounter that?
No, because I didn't investigate on these specific countries. I used the macro level data, but still we have a quite important number of countries, and the population also varies. I mean, it's not just 60,000, or we have sometimes 100 and something thousand population. But still, I think this deserves maybe a proper investigation to find out, because there's basically no answer. I mean, from the data, directly no answer, of course, because there's no data. But also, we are talking about different Iceland in the Caribbean, but also Iceland in Europe. European Iceland as well are concerned, like Monaco. There's nothing about Monaco, but Monaco is not a country of 50,000 people. And I'm pretty sure the person ruling the country is not aware of the entire population. So there must be some statistics somewhere, but maybe they have the reason to not get that available.
Fantastic. Are we going to say something, Cedric?
Yes, just on the, so it's the Ainu population is an interesting example, but it's actually true in indigenous population in the US, in Canada, in also Latin America, where data has been weaponized against them. And I was mentioning the long history of activism around geographical data. In Indonesia, for example, where the first what we call counter maps with indigenous population making their own maps to challenge the narrative created by the official maps, where, for example, the land disappeared, their land disappeared, or was not named, or the borders of their traditional territory disappeared. So there is indeed a lot of effort now from researchers and other groups to be mindful of working with indigenous population when designing data collection projects, and from those population themselves to also like come to the front and claim their sort of autonomy and right to be part of the discussion, be part of the process, to say what can be collected, how it should be collected, and what should not be collected.
Finally, we're going to move on to Julian Alexander, whose research explores classic literature through the hip-hop lens. So Julian is joined by Beatrice Newman, the head of department and course leader in fashion design at UEL. Beatrice, before we move on to Julian, do you want to just do a quick introduction of yourself? Just tell the audience a bit about yourself, please.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm the head of department for fashion at UEL. I sort of hail from the fashion industry, and I'm also an entrepreneur. So I have my own business, and I've been running it for about 10 years or more. And apart from that, my sort of area of research or development is sort of business aside, also in, I guess, racial bias, and interest in, I think, from a pedagogical perspective, closing the award gap, and how our pedagogy in curriculum can support students from the BAME group in, I guess, getting better degrees than what they're getting now, if you compare them to their non-BAME counterparts. So we've been running a group called Diverse Alliance at the University of East London, which Julian, a colleague of mine, who you'll get to speak to right now, has been supportive of. So that's me.
So my research is surrounding using hip hop and rap to tell stories on screen. I call it the cinematic hip hop narrative. And as a filmmaker, I was playing around with the idea of rapping stories. I wanted to kind of understand how stories were rhymed in the past, I grew up on Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe and all these folks. And so I decided to look at them and see if, one, their stories could be rapped. And since the narratives already exist, and even going further back, looking at Beowulf and stuff like that, cool. These stories aren't rhymed, they exist, which means to me they can be rapped. And then what does that do now to the story? And then when we add cinema on top of it, the whole thing about performing film or theater is that you have to, the whole thing about performing theater in those stories or performing on a track or in a song is that you have to say exactly how you feel. So if I'm sad or mad on a song, I have to say I'm mad and I'm sad for these reasons. In the film, nobody has to talk to tell the story. And so as a result, you get this interesting kind of way of playing with subtext. And then if we're rapping stories at the same time, how do we, I guess, build on top of that? That's the research, right? And it's weirdly complicated, it's so nuanced, so I barely know what I'm talking about, and that's why I'm researching it, I guess. So what I'm gonna do actually is rap some stories, and I'm kind of early on in my research, and I'm doing practice as research. And a lot of it is what does this do in this space? And as I kind of do this performance and explore these ideas, I'm curious about how it maybe reacts to your own understanding of Shakespeare or classic literature yourself. So I'll kind of get into it, and one thing that's kind of fascinating about how I kicked this off in the first place is I always loved to do theater and all these things. And I realized when I was on stage doing Shakespeare, the way that I would memorize my lines was by putting Shakespeare to a hip hop beat. And it kind of just worked for me. And then I was like, man, this is cool. As a result, it got me more interested in this, and then I remember being in school and really not caring about this stuff, and it took me so long. It took me to kind of explore these things on my own to realize that, I guess Shakespeare's all right. Yeah, I guess, in terms of, lyrically in the pen and I mean, personally, it's kind of basic. Sorry to the British folks out here though, but I needed to start somewhere, right? And I'm using him and some other folks as my foundation as I get a chance to then build upon the canon and widen my own lens, because I definitely want to lift up other folks that are not Shakespeare too. Although I have heard there's a rumor that Shakespeare was a Black woman, and I'm not going to build on that, right? We're academics here, not conspiracy theorists. All right, cool. So one part is, if you're familiar with Edgar Allan Poe, you probably heard The Raven, probably his most famous piece. And the way that I remember hearing it is pretty much like, once upon a midnight dreary, While I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came, I'm bored, sorry, I'm bored already. That's my own bias, right? The words are incredible, yes, indeed. But what happens if we just speed that up a little bit? Because with hip hop and growing up on hip hop, we have this predictability factor where we start to pick up on rhymes and things like that. And our ability to recognize lyrics, rhymes, and things is enhanced, which when we come back to maybe a slower paced tempo with some of these lyrics and words, it feels a little bit off, at least the people in my community. So what happens if we switch it up? You might not be able to hear the beat, but that's okay. Listen to the tempo. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping on my chamber door. 'Tis a visitor, I muttered, tapping on my chamber door. Merely this, and nothing more. Distinctly, I remember, it was in the bleak December, and a separate dying ember brought us close upon the floor.
That deserves a clap.
No, and I guess in layman's terms, I suppose, I'm trying to take this stuff and make it feel cool, right? And I'm certainly somebody that can appreciate the traditional text. But if I'm thinking about it also from a pedagogical standpoint, which is where my research started, but I'm moving away from it. My research is not about doing anything novel in pedagogy. But from a pedagogical standpoint, I think there's a sense of accessibility now with this. If you compare anything with Edgar Allan Poe to rappers such as Kendrick Lamar or J. Cole, or I guess some grime artists maybe like Stormzy, the way that we analyze Shakespeare, Poe, Coleridge is the same way that we analyze some of these hip hop artists, like maybe a Dave, who's known for writing very complicated lyrics, high in hyperbole and metaphor. So I'm gonna do one more little example for you of my practice. This is the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. I'll see how I feel. And maybe I'll do the whole thing, maybe I won't, who knows, we'll see.
What's your favorite Shakespeare?
Oh my gosh, you're putting me on my favorite. Well, the last one I just did was an Othello. I did a rap version of Othello, so I've been really into that. But to be honest, I like Antony and Cleopatra a lot. Like, that's probably my favorite Shakespeare is Antony and Cleopatra. I just think it's dope. I think it's this kind of nostalgic bias. Is that it? I don't know. Ancient Egypt's dope, So I like, I really just, it feels like a deep play to me. And there's also this really good history into it. And there's some a lot of it feels very real and it's built in real stuff, not a made up story, and that's kind of what I like. Other there's made up things, of course, but it's grounded in reality for the most part. This is the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. And this poem was written in 1798. And I put it initially on a beat by a rapper named Dave East, who made a song in 2016. And what I realized was that Dave East and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were writing on the same exact pentameter at 14 syllables apiece. And that inspired me to do my own original rendition of this. So this is an original beat made specifically for this of the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. So I'll do about just a minute or so of the track. So, the ship was cheered, the harbor cleared, merrily did we drop. Below the kirk, below the hill, below the lighthouse top. The sun came up upon the left, and out the sea came he, and he shone bright, and on the right went down into the sea. And now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. He struck with his overtaking wings and chased us south along. And then there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold. And ice, mast high, came floating by as green as emerald. So, are you following me? You can hear me okay? Basically, there's a ship, there's icebergs as tall as the ship. It's treacherous conditions to be a sailor. All right, so we're on the same page. Okay, cool. And through the drift, the snowy cliffs descend a dismal sheen. No shapes of men, no beastly kin, the ice was all between. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swound. At length it crossed an albatross and through the fog it came, as if it had been a Christian soul we hailed it in God's name. So an albatross is like the closest thing we have to a legendary Pokemon, but it's real. All right. It ate the food and there had ate and round and round the flew. The ice is split with thumb that fit. The helmsman steered us through. And the good stuff went to the blue behind and the albatross did follow. And every day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. And Mr. Cloud, our master shrouded, perfect rest was nine. While saw the night who fought so white, glimmered the white moonshine. God save the ancient mariner from the fiends that plague thee thus. While looked thou though with my crossbow and shot the albatross. They say it's bad luck to kill a seabird. I heard that from a movie called The Lighthouse like 2 years ago, but for any ancient scholars of the sea, let me know. The sun now rose upon the left and out to sea came he, still hit and missed and on the right went down into the sea. And the good south winds to flee behind, but no sweet bird would follow. Nor any day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. Because I have done a hellish thing and it would work on woe. For all a bird, I killed the bird that made the breeze to blow. Our wret's the day the bird to slay that made the breeze to blow. Our wret's the day says bird to slay that made the breeze to blow. Your dim no red like God's own head, the glorious son of Brice. For all a bird, I killed the bird that brought the fog and mist. So it's right, so day says bird to slay that bring the fog and mist. So it's right, so day says bird to slay that bring the fog and mist. See, at first they were mad at me because I killed the bird that made the breeze blow. They're actually happy because the bird bringing all those treacherous like conditions, terrible stuff. That's the one I actually killed. So now it's like pretty good weather. You know what I mean? Anyways, I'm gonna stop there. We're running out of time. But that's one of my favorite songs. I think it's a great example of just how this practice works in terms of from a performance perspective. You know, and there's this nice little translation going on here as well, where if you are used to the slower version of it, there's still, you know, we get you caught up, no problem. The whole point of all this stuff, from the Raven to the Ramen Ancient Mariner to the Shakespeare adaptations that I'm working on, is to film them and get them shot, and then use that to make original stories using hip hop and dialogue, you know, as duets, as scenes, etc. And then getting these things and distributing them not only in film festivals and things of that nature, but also into schools. I think there's just something interesting there. And again, since I'm early in my research, I'm exploring all of those types of options, but I'm really excited for the potential of what we're doing and how this stuff can really work, especially once we have the practical elements in place and the films ready to rock and roll. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you. And I don't know, so yeah, I mean, Beatrice, I'm curious because you heard, you've seen a few of my videos, you've seen some of my practical kind of outputs. And I guess I'm based on kind of the work that you do in terms of, I didn't talk much about bias, excuse me, I just kind of went in.
Right, I can feel that in for sure. So I mean, like, first of all, I mean, I really love what you do. Just seeing it for the first time today, I think was, and just you going through, you know, how you say a normal poem, and then when you rap it, there's something chemical that goes on in your mind that either makes you want to kind of really engage, and it's excitement. But I think this is where bias comes in, because if you were to speak to other people, rap is always considered as it's like marmalade, right? You either love it or you hate it. Is it Marmite? Not marmalade, Marmite. You either love it or you hate it.
And I think people feel the same way about marmalade too.
But I think, I don't know if that's also rooted in bias, because people hate it because of its connotations and the fact that there are many different types of rhythmic rap. And so I think it's just really about, you know, you're talking about getting this into schools, for instance, or trying to explain ancient texts in a more of a modern and fresh way. So you're educating others. Is that I think we need to also change that stereotype or understanding of what we mean by rap. And so before I came on this call, I was actually doing my own research. And I found it really interesting. If you go into the English dictionary and you define the word rap, it said easy and familiar. And I was like, oh, really? Rap is easy and familiar. You understand that from an English language. And you're like, I never actually considered that. And that's probably why my mind, for instance, was very drawn to the fact that when you rhymed Ancient Mariner or any other ancient poem, I was more attracted to it when you rapped it. But then what I also find is does that mean the English language is also is difficult or not familiar? And when you sit down and you consider the English language, I feel like it's deliberately made to be very correct. It's very exclusive and purposely difficult. And I think purposely difficult, what I mean by that is you've always got big words and hidden meanings. And for someone who doesn't come from an English culture, I feel like they find that they're always trying to understand or learn, not necessarily the English language, but what the actual words mean behind it, which is always not as transparent. And so actually from that perspective, English language is very difficult. If you're talking about rap in that perspective, I guess I don't know how it would correlate to other languages. But the fact that rap makes it a lot more, makes the English language more easier to understand, I think, you know, you're onto something there, and it's actually very exciting. And I think I'll end on that. I think rap in your example, Julian, is to make things more accessible to a language that's been inaccessible to a lot of people.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. Yeah, I totally agree. You know, and to kind of build on those points, you know, concerning bias too, based on my experience doing some of these lectures in person initially, before I even decided to come in on my PhD, I was brought in to talk about hip hop versus rap and kind of give examples of some folks and support some people who are doing some Hamilton presentations and stuff. You know, and one of the funniest moments that I had was I would ask people in the audience who likes rap. You know, maybe a couple hands go up, okay? Okay, who here likes Hamilton? You know, almost every hand went up. Wow, Hamilton, holy, yeah, I love it. What great stuff, you know?
For those that don't know what Hamilton is.
Right, Hamilton, of course, is it's an American hip hop musical made by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who specializes in, I guess, rap theater. From his show Freestyle Love Supreme, which is entirely an improvised rap freestyle show on Broadway, to In the Heights, which you would have seen in theaters possibly this summer, to Hamilton Now, which incorporates the most rap and is about Revolutionary War hero guy, Alexander Hamilton. I have some thoughts about those Revolutionary War guys, you know, the founding fathers, you know, but it's a great show if anybody gets a chance to see it. But yeah, a lot of that stuff is similar to what I'm doing. And oftentimes when I speak about my research, I'm like, it's like Hamilton, but we're incorporating cinematic language, which kind of changes the way just things are spoken about and things are said, and it changes the way a narrative is created. But yeah, I just thought that was kind of really fun and fascinating, you know, and also this idea of slang, which I think you're kind of dealing with, where I think in the rap community, and maybe I use slang a lot, you know, in certain places. I tend to not code switch as much sometimes, you know, and I think that's what this has taught me as well, just kind of be myself, you know, so I'll kind of use certain words that I might use, you know, in communities that I'm comfortable around. And I think that's kind of what this does too. And just because you're using slang doesn't mean that you don't know what you're talking about. And that's something I really enjoyed playing around with, this idea of words, language, etc.
Yeah. So one thing that I kind of wish we had a little bit more time for today was really kind of just the discussion or even the sense checking about what we will all do about just kind of checking ourselves, regulating ourselves, because ultimately those of us, regardless of where we are in the research journey, you know, we play such an important part in how the wider audience consumes what they consume. It's all of our hard work that we put in, that we give to policymakers and you know, what do you call those people, influencers, with our work that kind of influences the masses. And so I'm just kind of hoping that although we can't discuss it today, that there is just kind of a bit of reflection for all of us in the research community to start to think about how we can regulate ourselves, how we can check ourselves, how we can help our colleagues by gently, respectfully checking them and maybe asking them to make sure that what they're doing is robust. And, you know, even from, I know with John and Cedric, we didn't get to touch into that too much, but even how we address gaps in data, just to make sure that what we are presenting is as honest as it can be, because I feel like researchers have a responsibility.